Hey there, this is the first critique of the first assignment. And in Video Crits, I select 5 submissions and I run through alphabetically. So if yours is not included in this video crit, it'll be probably included in the next one or the one after that. We won't always have a video crit. Most of the time there will be a group critique in the discussions. So the way we look at this is in terms of the problem and how well you solve the problem. So the problem was to, within a specified design space, create a pattern-based design that communicated order transitioning into chaos. You could use black and white media, anything from markers to black gouache to graphite to colored pencil. Gray as well would be acceptable. And so we're looking at this in terms of how well do the concepts of order and of chaos get represented in the design, and how well is the transition between the two working. And we look at the whole design, not just the black or gray elements, the figure. We look at what the background is doing as well, because that's part of the design. We also look at craftsmanship and presentation. These are the 5 that we're looking at. Oh, by the way, the orientation was horizontal. We'll start with this one. So order, you should have defined it. Order is methodical, it's precise, it's an expected pattern or expected sequence. So order needs to be orderly, it's mathematic. And then chaos is total disorder. So it is the antithesis or the complete opposite of order. And both need to be represented in the design. One of the best ways to represent the concept or the difference between the two is to contrast the two. So you have very clear, very precise order and very chaotic disorder. And by comparing, the way we see things as human beings is we will assess and compare and look for contrasts as well as comparisons. How are things alike? That's how things compare. How are things different? That's how they contrast. So one of the big things we look for in any visual field whenever we see something is contrast. In this design, we have very ordered horizontal lines, and the negative space between the lines is fairly precise. The lines themselves are not all exactly alike. Some are thinner, some are a little bit thicker, some are softer, some are a little sharper. There's the use of implied line. There's the use of implied line here. We have another area where things are orderly. We've got some lines that are kind of fading out. And these are diagonal, these are horizontal. And then we start getting a little bit chaotic here. Starting to get a little bit imprecise, but this is not by any means disorder. This could be taken a lot further to represent disorder. There's a lot of things going on here, and it looks like there is a definite break. And the transition area is really sharp and abrupt. In other words, it's a very small transition area. There is not a gradual movement from one idea to the other. It's an abrupt change. We notice this over here because it's empty. And so this space is not working well. And this space down here is not working well either. And the reason they're not working well is, first of all, they're both in the corners, and they're somewhat framed by the edge of the design frame and the positive elements in the design. So this is framed here, framed by this, and framed by this. So we will see and focus on negative space in certain situations. And that's not what you want to do necessarily. This actually is not a transition from one idea into another. It's actually more like 2 separate ideas laid side by side. One is a little more prone to be chaotic, which is this section here on the left, and then this, which is kind of nesting or surrounding, embracing this mess, is a little bit, as I said, imprecise. It is not chaotic down here, but this is a different idea with what's going on here than this. You have linear elements and you have precision of negative space between the linear elements, but there's very little relationship between what's going on in the left side and what's going on in the right side. Craftsmanship is good. It is shot well. Looking at the image, we have right angles and right angles. So we have 4 right angles, 90-degree angles at the corners, which means that the edges are parallel vertically and also horizontally. So that's the way you want to shoot or scan and shoot meaning photograph and present your work. You do not want to present your work at an angle. You would not present to a client at an angle. Get used to presenting your work in a professional and clean, precise, high value, high quality manner. Okay, the first thing we notice here is that there's a cast shadow, probably of the photographer. And this is also not what you want to do when you're presenting your work to a client. So when you are shooting, don't stand in front of the light source. Best thing to do is put 2 light sources coming in at opposite angles and try to get things evenly lit. If you don't have 2 light sources inside, indoors, then take it outdoors into bright shade and shoot your work there, but don't stand in front of your work so that you are casting a shadow on your work. The craftsmanship on this is pretty good. The presentation looks like things are definitely 90 degrees in the corners, and then the vertical edges and the horizontal edges parallel. There's a curl here. There looks like a cast shadow or something like that. There's also some weird little glitchy marks, which is also not what you want to do with presentation. You want to erase those if those are graphite, and you want to make sure that if you're presenting something in actuality, that things, you don't have any curling corners and things like that. By the same token, if you're presenting something digitally, you want to make sure that there are no artifacts. Be very careful with how you present your work. If you get lazy about how you present your work, you will lose value. People will not value what you do. So on the left, we have order, definitely. And then there is a movement, transition, sort of kind of undulates. It starts here, moves over here, moves way over here. So there is kind of a transitional area that is not making a straight line. And then we get kind of curly and tangled over on the right-hand side. So definitely we have the sense that there's order, and then there's chaos, and there's a movement from one to the other across the distance of the design. And the movement goes horizontally. It could have gone diagonally. It could have gone radially, meaning from the center out or from the outside in. Could have gone vertically. So the directionality of that progression, that change up, was up to you. So it looks like it's mostly pencil, and there is change in line quality, there's change in line weight, there's a lot of change in direction. So the problem overall is solved well. There is one line that runs all the way through that doesn't change. The negative space between the horizontal lines is even. It's consistent all the way down, and it's actually utilizing the top edge and the bottom edge in terms of how the space is divided into separate intervals. So the design solution works really well. The presentation needs work. What's not real clear here is the sense of implied line. Okay, because the composition is closed, there is a margin or border all the way around. We notice that there is an implied line, and it's not really precise. So it has a sense of straightness, and then it rises and falls, goes kind of straight, bumps up. And so there's not a lot of precision on the ends of the lines up here. And this becomes kind of a focal point because it goes from a thicker line to a thinner line, and there's an angle to it. And so it's kind of the odd man out. There is a change up in pattern, in weight of line, and amount of negative space in between the lines. And so thicker, less negative space is a darker area. Thinner, either the same amount of negative space or more negative space, we get lighter. So there are value changes in these various sections. And then we have 2 fairly thick lines right here. So these 2 lines and then this call our attention. This really isn't helping the design because it is kind of an exclamation mark, but it's not doing anything to communicate the idea. The chaos is where things look like they're frayed. And so it's kind of like we have a hem or a selvage or an edge of a piece of fabric where the threads are starting to unravel. The curved lines here are placed randomly. They don't look like they're attaching or stemming from the lines. It looks like they're overlaid or attached. So it looks like these lines have been added on top of the straight lines. But they are fairly random, and they do contrast. They do create a sense of disorder. The transition, though, is abrupt. We go from the vertical lines immediately into the chaotic curved lines, and there is no transition. And then we do notice this implied line and all of this negative space versus all of the positive elements over here toward the right. So as we're looking at the design space as an entirety, as a whole, is the space divided in a pleasing manner? It's not really uncomfortable, so yes, it is pleasing. We have a sense of maybe this being farther away than these lines here. Definitely have a pattern effect. There is a strong story to this. It's a very clearly stated idea. It's presented well, it's clean, it's neat. We're looking at right angles on the corners. So it solves the problem. It could do it better. There could be a better transition, and we could edit out the things that aren't necessary. Okay, here we have 3 lines at the top surrounded by negative space. So there are basically 4 intervals. If we start with the top of the frame of reference, that distance is about the same as that, and then that to here, and there is a strong implied line here. So we have the order here, and it's about a third, maybe 25 to 30% of the overall vertical space. And then the rest of it is more random. It's not really disorderly, though. It's very controlled. Both the right side, which has a little more wobbly linear elements, and the left side, which is more precise. So we basically have 3 different ideas here all laid side by side. We have the idea at the top, which is this order, which is well established. We've got the implied line. We have what's going on here, and we have what's going on here, and there is a division right here. So there's no transition, and it doesn't get chaotic enough. So this is not actually communicating to the general population order and chaos. This is communicating something very different, and it's not really clear what it's communicating. So if either or both of the lower ideas were blended, and there was a transition between the lower part and the upper part of the design, it would solve the problem more clearly. It's presented fairly well. A little bit of glitchiness down over here and over in here. But overall, it's not bad. It misses the mark in solving the problem. And the lines are mostly all the same weight and character. The negative space in the lower area is very controlled. There's a kind of a standard proportion of negative to positive in the lower half or the lower portion, because it's more than half. And remember that negative space plays a strong part in any design, so you cannot overlook it. Okay, so this first thing we notice is the glue stain. So when you're working with rubber cement, you want to make sure you clean it up with the rubber cement pickup, first of all. And it can stain on certain types of boards and papers, so what you want to do is only put the rubber cement where you need it. And remember to coat both surfaces, let both surfaces dry, and then put them together. The other thing too is that this is shot at an angle. And so we're looking at it in perspective view, where the closer edge is longer and the farther edge is shorter. And the sides are not parallel to each other. So when you photograph, make sure that your camera is directly perpendicular to the surface that you're shooting. So in the upper right, we have a lot of precision and a lot of negative space. And then we're introducing different types of lines kind of going askew on diagonals, and there's a mild sense of disorder. The wavy lines don't really add anything. Although they're attached to some of the diagonal lines, they're not helping express the idea. They separate visually from the other lines, which are a lot more delicate. There could be something to say for the introduction of something that just doesn't belong to create more chaos. But if you just look at the wavy lines, they are strongly directional, so there is an issue of control there. There's a diagonal movement on each one that's lower left to upper right, so they aren't chaotic enough. And they're really not helping your design as they are. They probably should be a little more integrated with the lines over here on the left. And more differences going on, more randomness in terms of what these lines are doing. The transition is sort of right here, but it's not really a transition. It's, again, one idea and another idea, and there's no blending of the two. So things are a lot more precise, a little less precise, and then the introduction of the wavy lines is like another idea altogether.